The day I pounded the first fence post into the ground behind my house in Gilbert, Arizona, I had no idea I was about to become public enemy #1 in the Sunset Ridge community. But I should have known trouble was brewing when I saw Deborah Martinez watching me from her upstairs window with binoculars. I had just bought my first home 3 months earlier, a decent 2-story place on the edge of our development with a half-acre lot that backed up to open desert. The property line was clearly marked on my survey, and after weeks of planning, I was finally ready to install the 6-foot cedar privacy fence I had been dreaming about since closing day. My dog, a rescue pit bull named Bruno, needed a secure place to run, and I wanted some separation from the walking trail that ran just beyond my yard, where curious hikers constantly peered into my back windows. The morning was already heating up to 90 degrees, even though it was only March, and I was sweating through my shirt as I worked. I had hired a professional fence company called Desert Boundaries, and their crew of 4 guys was making quick work of the installation. By noon, they had completed the entire north side of my property, and the fence looked perfect, running in a perfectly straight line exactly where my survey indicated the property boundary sat. I was inside getting water for everyone when my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was Deborah Martinez, the president of our HOA, flanked by 2 other women I recognized from neighborhood events. Deborah was in her early 50s with short blonde hair cut in that distinctive speak-to-the-manager style, wearing pressed khaki capris and a Sunset Ridge HOA polo shirt that she had apparently had custom-made. "Paul Henderson, we need to talk about what you are doing," Deborah said without any greeting or pleasantries. Her voice had that sharp edge that immediately put my defenses up. "I am building a fence," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I submitted my application to the Architectural Review Committee 6 weeks ago and received approval." Deborah waved her hand dismissively. "That approval was conditional, and besides, we did not realize you were planning to build it so high or so far back. This fence is going to completely block the view of the desert from the community walking trail." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. The walking trail is not HOA property. It is public land maintained by the town, and my fence is 6 feet high, which is within both town code and HOA guidelines. I have all the documentation inside. The guidelines state that fences should not impede the aesthetic enjoyment of common areas. One of the other women chimed in. Her name was Susan something, and she served as the HOA treasurer. "The trail is not a common area," I repeated. "It is public land that happens to run behind several properties in this neighborhood. My fence is entirely on my property, and I have a survey to prove it." Deborah's face was turning an unpleasant shade of red. "Young man, I have lived in this community for 12 years, and I have walked that trail nearly every day. The view of the open desert and the mountains in the distance is one of the primary selling points of homes in this neighborhood. Your fence is going to ruin that experience for everyone." "With respect, Deborah, the view from public land across my private property is not something the HOA has any right to control. I own this land, I pay property taxes on it, and I have every legal right to fence it." The third woman, whose name I did not know, spoke up. "We could make things very difficult for you if you insist on being uncooperative. The HOA has significant authority to enforce community standards." I felt my jaw tighten. "Is that a threat?" "It is a statement of fact," Deborah said coldly. "I strongly suggest you halt construction immediately while we reconvene the Architectural Review Committee to reconsider your application." "My application was already approved," I said firmly. "The fence is being built exactly as specified in my plans, which you all signed off on. If you had concerns about the location or the view, you should have raised them during the review period. This conversation is not over, Deborah snapped, then turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, her companions hurrying after her. I stood there for a moment, my good mood thoroughly soured, then went back to check on the fence crew. The foreman, a guy named Miguel who had been doing this work for 20 years, asked if everything was okay. "Just HOA drama," I told him. "Please keep working. Everything we are doing is completely legal and approved." By late afternoon, the fence was complete. It looked fantastic, running along my entire back property line and the sides, creating a fully enclosed backyard. The cedar had a beautiful natural color that would weather to a nice silver gray over time, and the posts were set deep in concrete to handle Arizona's occasional monsoon winds. Bruno was thrilled, racing back and forth along the fence line, finally able to be outside without a leash. I spent the evening relaxing on my back patio, enjoying my new private space and deliberately not thinking about Deborah Martinez or the HOA. But at 9 o'clock, just as the sun was setting, my doorbell rang again. This time it was a Gilbert police officer, young and professional looking. My heart rate kicked up immediately. "Are you Paul Henderson?" he asked. "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" "I received a complaint about a fence that was allegedly built without proper permits. Can you show me your documentation?" I invited him in and pulled out my folder containing my town building permit, my HOA approval letter, my property survey, and all my receipts. The officer reviewed everything carefully, then nodded. "Everything appears to be in order here." The complaint mentioned that the fence was blocking public access to a trail. "That is completely false," I said. "The fence is entirely on my property. The trail is about 15 feet beyond my property line. No one's access has been affected at all." The officer made some notes. "Okay, I will include that in my report. You should not have any further issues, but if someone files another complaint, we may need to send someone from code enforcement to verify." "I understand. Thank you for being reasonable about this." After he left, I was fuming. Deborah had actually called the police on me for legally building a fence on my own property. This was clearly going to be a bigger problem than I had anticipated. The next morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox from the Sunset Ridge HOA. It was a formal notice of violation, stating that my fence was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards, and demanding that I either remove it or modify it within 30 days or face daily fines of $100. I immediately called my real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen who had handled my home purchase. I scanned and emailed her all my documentation, including the violation notice. "This is ridiculous," Patricia said when she called me back an hour later. "You have written approval from their own architectural review committee. They cannot retroactively revoke that approval without cause, and personal preference about a view from public land is not legal cause. So what do I do? Write a response disputing the violation. I will help you draft it. Make it clear that you intend to fight any fines, and that you will sue the HOA for harassment if they continue. That should make them back off." We spent an hour on the phone crafting a detailed response that cited Arizona HOA law, the specific provisions of our HOA covenants, and several relevant court cases. Patricia made the letter sound professional but firm, and we sent it via certified mail that afternoon. For about a week, things were quiet. I started to hope that maybe Deborah had gotten the message and would leave me alone, but I should have known better. The following Monday, I came home from work to find a town code enforcement officer placing a notice on my door. He was an older guy with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he had dealt with a lot of nonsense in his career. "Paul Henderson," he asked as I got out of my car. "That's me. What is this about? I have received multiple complaints about your fence. I need to verify that it meets setback requirements and height restrictions. I have all my permits and my survey. Would you like to see them?" His expression softened slightly. "That would be helpful, yes." I showed him everything, and he pulled out a measuring tape to verify the fence height and its distance from the property line. After about 20 minutes of checking, he nodded. "Everything is in compliance. Your fence is fine." I am going to note this inspection in the system, which should prevent any future complaints from generating another site visit. "Can I ask who filed the complaints?" He hesitated, then said, "I probably should not, but since this seems like harassment, I will tell you it was multiple people, all from the same address. A Deborah Martinez." "Of course it was," I muttered. The code enforcement officer gave me a sympathetic look. "HOA issues. You have no idea." "I have seen this before," he said. "HOAs think they have more authority than they actually do. Your fence is legal. It is on your property, and you have all the right permits. If she keeps filing false complaints, you might want to consider filing a harassment complaint with the town." That was good advice, and I thanked him before he left. But I was getting seriously tired of this situation. All I wanted was a fence for my dog, and Deborah was treating me like I had committed some terrible crime against the community. The next evening, I attended my first HOA board meeting. Our community held them monthly in the clubhouse, and they were supposedly open to all residents. I had never bothered going before, but now I wanted to confront Deborah directly in a public forum. About 30 people were scattered around the clubhouse meeting room when I arrived. Deborah sat at a table at the front with 4 other board members. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me, but she did not say anything. The meeting covered boring topics for the first 40 minutes, budgets and landscaping maintenance and pool rules. Then, during the open comment period, I raised my hand. "Yes, Paul," Deborah said with barely concealed irritation. I stood up so everyone could see me. "I want to address the violation notice I received about my fence. I built that fence with full HOA approval, with all proper permits and entirely on my property. The notice claims it violates aesthetic standards, but the real issue seems to be that you personally do not like that it blocks a view from public land. That is not a legal basis for a violation." Several people murmured, and I saw a few nods of agreement. Deborah's face tightened. "The Architectural Review Committee approved your plans based on incomplete information. We were not aware of the impact the fence would have on the community's enjoyment of our surroundings. The plans clearly showed the fence location, height, and materials. What information was incomplete?" "The visual impact assessment," she said, which was clearly something she had just made up. "There is no requirement in our HOA covenants for a visual impact assessment," I countered. "I have read the covenants thoroughly. In fact, Section 7.3 explicitly states that property owners have the right to install fencing up to 6 feet in height along property boundaries as long as it meets town code and uses approved materials. My fence meets all those requirements." One of the other board members, a man named Greg, spoke up. "Deborah, Paul is right. I went back and reviewed the covenants after we issued that violation notice, and I do not think we have grounds to enforce it." Deborah shot him a furious look. "The board can interpret the covenants as we see fit to maintain community standards." "Within reason," Greg replied, "but we cannot just make up violations because we do not like something that was already approved." "I agree with Greg," another board member said, a woman named Linda. "I think we should rescind the violation notice." Absolutely not, Deborah snapped. This is about preserving the character of our neighborhood. It is about you being able to see the desert from your walking trail, I said bluntly. Which is not an HOA concern. The trail is public land. Watch your tone with me, young man. I will use whatever tone I want when I am being harassed by my HOA president for doing something completely legal. The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with several people trying to talk at once. Eventually, Greg called for a vote on whether to rescind the violation notice. The vote was 3 in favor of rescinding, 2 against, Deborah and Susan. I had won, at least for the moment. But as I left the meeting, Deborah cornered me in the parking lot. "You think you are very clever," she hissed. "But I have ways of making your life miserable in this community. Maybe I will start doing monthly property inspections. I am sure I can find something wrong with your home." "That sounds like harassment, Deborah. I would be careful if I were you." "It is not harassment to enforce community standards. You are going to regret making an enemy of me." I walked away without responding, but my hands were shaking. This woman was unhinged, and I had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more violation notices. One claimed my trash cans were visible from the street, which was not true since I kept them in my garage. Another claimed my front yard landscaping was not being properly maintained, despite the fact that I paid a lawn service to come weekly. The third claimed I had parked a commercial vehicle in my driveway, referring to my personal truck that had a toolbox in the bed. Each violation notice came with the threat of $100 daily fines. I disputed every single one with detailed photographic evidence, and each time, the board voted to rescind the violations over Deborah's objections. But it was exhausting and time-consuming, and it was clear that Deborah was going to keep this up indefinitely. Patricia Chen advised me to start documenting everything for a potential harassment lawsuit. "You are building a strong case," she told me. "If she continues this pattern, we can sue both her personally and the HOA for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress." But before we could take legal action, things escalated in a way I never expected. I came home from work one day in early April to find that someone had spray painted "Remove the fence" in large red letters across my beautiful cedar fence. I immediately called the Gilbert police and filed a vandalism report. The responding officer was the same young cop who had come about the permit complaint. He took photos and a statement and told me he would check if any neighbors had security cameras that might have caught the vandal. "You have any idea who might have done this?" he asked. "I have a strong suspicion, but no proof," I said, thinking of Deborah. 2 days later, the detective assigned to my case called me. "Mr. Henderson, we pulled footage from a neighbor's security camera. The vandalism occurred at 2:30 in the morning yesterday. We have a clear image of the suspect." "Who was it?" "A woman named Deborah Martinez." "Do you know her?" My jaw dropped. "She is my HOA president. We have been in a dispute about the fence." "That explains it then. We are going to bring her in for questioning." Vandalism of this nature is a Class 2 misdemeanor in Arizona. She will likely be offered a plea deal if she agrees to pay restitution. "I want to press charges fully," I said firmly. "This woman has been harassing me for weeks." The detective noted that, and 2 hours later, Deborah Martinez was arrested at her home. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, my phone was buzzing with texts from neighbors I barely knew, some expressing support, others asking what had happened. The next day, a different neighbor knocked on my door. Her name was Rachel Everett, and she lived 3 houses down. She was maybe 40, with dark hair and a friendly smile. "I just wanted to say I am sorry about what Deborah did," Rachel said. And I wanted you to know that a lot of us in the neighborhood think she has been way out of line. Your fence looks great, and you had every right to build it." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "It has been a frustrating few weeks. A bunch of us have been talking, and we are planning to call for a special election to remove Deborah from the HOA board. Would you be willing to make a statement at the meeting?" "Absolutely." Over the next week, Rachel and several other neighbors collected signatures to force a special meeting. They needed 20% of homeowners to sign, and they got nearly 40%. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Deborah had been released on her own recognizance after her arrest, and she had hired a lawyer who was apparently advising her to stay quiet about the whole situation. But that did not stop her from sending out a mass email to the neighborhood claiming that I had entrapped her and that the vandalism charges were a misunderstanding. The email was so ridiculous that it actually helped my case. Several people who had been on the fence about the recall effort were pushed firmly into the anti-Deborah camp by her unhinged message. The special meeting was packed. Every seat in the clubhouse was full, and people lined the walls. Rachel stood up and presented a detailed timeline of Deborah's harassment, including copies of all the violation notices I had received and evidence that none of them had been valid. She also presented statements from other homeowners who had experienced similar harassment from Deborah over the years. It turned out I was not the only one. A retired couple had been targeted because they painted their house a slightly different shade of beige than Deborah preferred. A single mother had been constantly cited for minor violations like a garden hose being visible. A veteran who worked nights had received noise complaints for running his washing machine in the afternoon, while Deborah was apparently trying to nap. The pattern was clear. Deborah had been using her position as HOA president as a personal fiefdom to harass anyone who annoyed her. When it came time for Deborah to defend herself, she stood up and delivered a rambling speech about how she had dedicated 12 years of her life to maintaining property values and community standards, and how people like me were destroying the neighborhood. She actually claimed that my fence had already caused property values to drop by 5%, which was completely fabricated. The vote was not even close. 87% of attending homeowners voted to remove Deborah from the board immediately. Susan, her treasurer ally, resigned on the spot rather than face her own recall. The board appointed Rachel as interim president and scheduled elections for the following month. I thought that would be the end of it, but Deborah was not done yet. 2 weeks later, in late April, I came home to find that someone had cut down a section of my fence. Not spray painted it this time, but actually sawed through the posts and rails, leaving a 10-foot gap in the middle of the back fence line. This time I did not hesitate. I called both the police and Patricia Chen. The damage was over $2,000, which elevated the crime from misdemeanor vandalism to criminal damage, a Class 4 felony in Arizona. The police came out and processed the scene. They found boot prints in the soft dirt near the damaged section and took castings. They also found a discarded hacksaw blade in the desert brush beyond my property line. The detective called me the next day. The boot prints match a pair of boots we photographed at Deborah Martinez's house when we executed a search warrant this morning. The hacksaw blade had her fingerprints on it. She did it again. I was stunned. Even after being arrested the first time. Some people do not handle perceived injustice well, the detective said dryly. She is being charged with felony criminal damage this time. Given that this is her second offense related to your property, the prosecutor is taking it seriously. She is looking at possible jail time. Good, I said coldly. I was done feeling sorry for this woman. Deborah was arrested again that afternoon. This time, she did not make bail immediately, and she spent 3 days in Maricopa County Jail before her lawyer could arrange her release. The local Gilbert newspaper picked up the story, running a piece about the HOA president, who had been arrested twice for vandalizing a homeowner's fence. The publicity was mortifying for Deborah, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that her husband was furious and had moved out to stay with his brother. Her adult children had apparently stopped speaking to her. Her entire life was falling apart because she could not handle the fact that someone had built a fence on their own property. The criminal case moved forward through the summer. Deborah rejected 2 separate plea deals that would have involved probation and restitution, insisting that she was being persecuted and that I was the real criminal for ruining the neighborhood. Her lawyer eventually withdrew from the case, and she had to hire a new one. Meanwhile, I had my fence repaired, this time adding security cameras that covered every angle of my property. Rachel was elected HOA president permanently in the May elections, and she immediately implemented reforms to prevent the kind of abuse that Deborah had engaged in. The architectural review process was streamlined and made more transparent, and limits were placed on the number of property inspections that could be conducted without cause. I actually started to enjoy living in Sunset Ridge. With Deborah gone, the neighborhood felt friendlier and more relaxed. Rachel and I became good friends, and she introduced me to several other neighbors. I got invited to barbecues and pool parties at the community center. Bruno became the unofficial neighborhood mascot, with kids asking to pet him whenever I walked him around the streets. In August, Deborah's criminal trial finally took place. I had to testify about the harassment and the 2 incidents of property damage. The prosecutor presented overwhelming evidence, including security footage, fingerprints, boot prints, and documentation of Deborah's obsessive campaign against me. Deborah's defense was essentially that she had been driven temporarily insane by the stress of seeing my fence from her favorite walking trail. Her new lawyer tried to paint her as a dedicated community servant who had simply snapped under pressure. The jury did not buy it. They found her guilty of felony criminal damage after less than 2 hours of deliberation. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Patricia Ramirez, was clearly unimpressed with Deborah's behavior. Miss Martinez, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that position to harass a homeowner who was doing nothing more than exercising his legal rights on his own property, Judge Ramirez said during sentencing. Your actions were not a momentary lapse in judgment. They were a sustained campaign of harassment that escalated to criminal behavior not once but twice. This court takes property crime seriously, and we take crimes motivated by personal vendettas even more seriously. The judge sentenced Deborah to 18 months in county jail, with the possibility of release after 9 months for good behavior. She was also ordered to pay full restitution for both incidents of damage, plus my legal fees, which totaled over $15,000. I watched from the courtroom gallery as Deborah was led away in handcuffs, crying and still insisting that she had been in the right. I felt no satisfaction, just a sense of weary relief that it was finally over. The civil lawsuit came next. Patricia Chen filed a comprehensive harassment suit against both Deborah personally and the Sunset Ridge HOA for failing to control her behavior. The HOA's insurance company settled quickly for $50,000, not wanting the bad publicity of going to trial. Deborah had no assets to speak of after her legal fees, so we settled her portion of the lawsuit for a judgment that would garnish her wages for the next 10 years. By September, life had returned to normal. My fence stood undamaged, the cedar weathering to a beautiful silvery color just as I had hoped. Bruno loved his yard and I loved my privacy. The desert view was still there for anyone who wanted to enjoy it from the public trail. They just had to look past my property now instead of across it. Rachel turned out to be an excellent HOA president. She actually reduced our dues by 15% by cutting unnecessary expenses and negotiating better contracts with vendors. She implemented a community garden project that brought neighbors together. She organized a neighborhood watch program that reduced petty crime. Under her leadership, Sunset Ridge became the kind of community that people actually wanted to live in, not just because of property values, but because of genuine neighborly spirit. One cool October evening, I was sitting on my back patio with a beer watching Bruno chase lizards in the fading light when Rachel stopped by with her husband and kids. We had become close friends over the months, and they often came over to use my backyard since theirs was much smaller. "I still cannot believe all that craziness with Deborah," Rachel said, settling into one of my patio chairs while her kids played with Bruno. "I mean, all of this over a fence. Some people just cannot handle not getting their way," I replied. I think she had been the queen bee for so long that she forgot she was not actually royalty. The neighborhood is so much better now. I have had at least 5 people tell me they were thinking about selling just to get away from her constant harassment. "Are you going to run for president again next year?" "Probably," Rachel said. "I kind of like it, actually. When it is about actually helping the community instead of being a petty tyrant, it is pretty rewarding." Her husband, Tom, laughed. "She spends half her free time on HOA stuff now." "I have created a monster." "A benevolent monster," Rachel corrected with a grin. We sat there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. The same view that Deborah had been so obsessed with preserving was right there, just as beautiful as ever, just beyond the fence line that had caused so much trouble. I thought about how a simple decision to build a fence had spiraled into months of harassment, arrests, a trial, and ultimately a complete transformation of our HOA leadership. It seemed absurd in retrospect, the idea that a piece of cedar fencing could cause such chaos. But I also realized that it had never really been about the fence. It had been about power and control, about one person's inability to accept that she did not have the right to dictate every aspect of other people's lives. Deborah had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, and my fence had been the challenge to her authority that she could not tolerate. In a way, I was glad it had happened. Not the harassment or the vandalism or the stress, but the end result. The neighborhood was better off without Deborah's toxic leadership. Property owners were more confident exercising their rights. The HOA was functioning as it should, as a service organization rather than an enforcement arm. And I had my fence, solid and sturdy, providing exactly the privacy and security I had wanted from the beginning. November brought cooler weather, perfect for spending time outdoors. I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my backyard, something that would have been impossible without the fence keeping Bruno contained and giving everyone a sense of private space. Nearly 40 people showed up, and everyone complimented the fence, several asking for my contractor's information because they wanted to install their own. During the party, one of my neighbors mentioned that he had driven past Deborah's house recently and seen a for sale sign. "Her husband is divorcing her," Rachel told me quietly. "I heard he is selling the house and moving to Scottsdale. Deborah will be out of jail by next summer, but she will have nothing to come back to here." "That is sad," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything she had put me through, I could not help but feel some pity for how completely her life had imploded. "It is," Rachel agreed. But she made her choices. You gave her multiple opportunities to back off, and she kept escalating. Some people just cannot admit when they are wrong. As winter settled over Arizona, bringing mild temperatures and clear skies, I found myself reflecting on the whole experience. I had learned a lot about property rights, HOA law, and the importance of standing up for yourself when you know you are in the right. I had also learned that some battles, even when you win them, come with a heavy cost for everyone involved. But most importantly, I had learned the value of community. Not the forced, artificial community that Deborah had tried to maintain through fear and harassment, but the real community that had emerged after she was gone. Neighbors looking out for each other, people getting together because they wanted to rather than because they were obligated to, an HOA that actually served its members instead of ruling over them. In December, the last piece of the saga finally concluded. Patricia Chen called to tell me that Deborah had filed for bankruptcy, and my judgment against her would likely be discharged except for the restitution portion, which could not be eliminated in bankruptcy. I would probably never see most of the money from the civil suit, but I had never really been in it for the money anyway. You did win, you know, Patricia told me. Not just the legal case, but the bigger battle. You stood up to a bully and you changed your community for the better. That is worth more than any settlement check. She was right, and I knew it. The fence still stood exactly where I had built it, on my property line, providing privacy and security for me and Bruno. The view from the public trail was still beautiful, and the dozen other homeowners who had installed fences since my battle with Deborah had not diminished that beauty at all. The HOA was functioning better than it had in years, with fair enforcement of reasonable rules and no more petty harassment. Property values had actually gone up, not down, as word spread that Sunset Ridge was now under sensible management. And I had a circle of genuine friends in the neighborhood, people I could count on and who could count on me. That was worth far more than any desert view. On Christmas Eve, I stood in my backyard with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. Bruno sat beside me, leaning against my leg the way he did when he was content. The fence surrounded us, solid and secure, the physical manifestation of boundaries properly set and defended. I thought about sending Deborah some kind of message, maybe wishing her well despite everything. But I decided against it. Some chapters needed to close completely, and sometimes the best thing you could do for everyone involved was to simply move forward and leave the past behind. The fence had been worth fighting for, not because it was particularly important in itself, but because it represented something fundamental: the right to use your own property as you saw fit within the bounds of law and reason. That was a principle worth defending, even when the defense came with costs. As the sun climbed higher and the desert heat began to build, I went back inside to start preparing for the neighborhood potluck dinner Rachel was hosting that evening. Life had moved on, the community had healed, and justice had been served. The fence stood exactly where it belonged, on my property line, and no one was ever going to make me take it down.